Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a crowded, dimly lit room in the middle of the 19th century. The air is heavy and stagnant, thick with the overwhelming smell of fresh sawdust and the saltiness of human sweat. In the center of this room, all eyes are fixed on a heavy wooden table, where a man is strapped down by his leather belts and the weight of several strong assistants. These men are not medical experts. Their only job is to use their physical strength to hold the patient still, pinning his limbs to the wood so that he cannot struggle. Nearby, a surgeon stands with his tools. He is not checking a monitor or reviewing a complex chart. Instead, he is checking the sharpness of a long steel blade and glancing repeatedly at his pocket watch. In this era, the measure of a great surgeon is not his delicate touch, his bedside manner, or his deep knowledge of microscopic anatomy. Success is measured purely by the clock. A surgeon is judged by his hands and his speed. A leg might be removed in under 2 minutes, while the patient screams in an agony that most of us living today cannot even begin to fathom. This was the brutal, visceral reality of medicine for thousands of years. It was a world where the primary barrier to healing was not just the disease itself, but the sheer, unmitigated horror of the pain required to fix it. Before the middle of the 1840s, surgery was never a routine choice. It was a desperate gamble, a last resort reserved for someone who was already standing on the precipice of certain death. If you were suffering from a growing tumor, a shattered limb that refused to heal, or a deep internal infection, your options were terrifyingly limited. You could either wait for the end to come naturally, or you could submit to a procedure that was often just as traumatic as the condition it was meant to treat. This created a massive bottleneck in the progress of human knowledge. Doctors and scientists were not ignorant of the body, but they were limited by what the human frame could endure. They knew that they could potentially save far more lives if they could just find a way to slow down. They knew they could fix complicated internal problems if they only had the luxury of time to explore the body carefully without the distractions of a thrashing, screaming patient. But the clock was always the enemy. The constant threat was the onset of shock, a physiological collapse that occurred when the body simply could not handle any more trauma. If a surgery took too long, the patient did not die from the ailment, but from the stress of the pain itself. This hard constraint kept the entire field of medicine in a dark age for centuries, unable to move past the most basic and rapid procedures. The quest to turn off the human sensation of pain was not a new ambition. Since the dawn of civilization, people had tried almost everything to dull the senses. There were heavy doses of alcohol that left patients drunk but still aware of the knife. There were ancient herbal concoctions made from roots and flowers that barely managed to dull the sharpest edges of the sensation. Some practitioners even experimented with mesmerism, trying to put the mind into a trance, or used the crude method of hitting patients on the head with enough force to knock them unconscious. However, none of these methods were reliable, and many were just as dangerous as the surgery itself. The breakthrough that finally changed everything did not come from a grand medical academy or a famous surgeon. Instead, it arrived from the world of chemistry and the simple power of human curiosity. For some time, people had been aware of certain gases and their strange effects on the human mind. In certain social circles, nitrous oxide and ether were used as party tricks or sources of entertainment. People would gather to inhale these substances just to feel lightheaded or to laugh uncontrollably at nothing. These gatherings were often chaotic, with people tripping over furniture and bruising themselves, yet they would often stand up and realize they had felt nothing at all during their falls. It took a significant leap of imagination for someone to realize that if a person could stumble over a chair without feeling pain at a party, they might be able to undergo a life-saving surgery in that same altered state. The definitive turning point for this theory occurred in a grand, domed lecture hall in Boston. A young dentist who had seen the effects of these gases firsthand finally convinced a prominent and well-respected surgeon to let him demonstrate a new method for dulling pain. He intended to use a chemical called ether. On the day of the demonstration, the room was packed to the rafters with skeptical medical students and established doctors who fully expected to witness another humiliating failure. The atmosphere was tense as the dentist applied a cloth soaked in the chemical to the patient's face. As the man breathed in the vapors, he did not fight or scream. Instead, he drifted into a deep, heavy, and silent sleep. The surgeon began his work, performing the operation in a room that was uncharacteristically quiet. When the procedure was finished and the patient finally blinked his eyes open, he claimed he had felt nothing at all during the entire event. The surgeon turned to the stunned, silent audience and remarked that this was no trick. In that single quiet moment, the fundamental relationship between human beings and their own physical bodies changed forever. The silence of that room was the actual sound of a new era beginning, one where the body was no longer a cage of suffering. Word of this incredible success traveled with breathtaking speed, crossing the Atlantic Ocean and spreading through the global medical community like wildfire. However, as with any new technology, the early days were full of complications. Ether was far from perfect. It was highly flammable, making it dangerous to use in rooms lit by candles or gas lamps. It had a terrible, lingering smell that stayed in the halls of hospitals for days, and it often caused patients to cough or struggle violently as they were first going under. These drawbacks led researchers to look for better alternatives, which eventually brought a substance called chloroform into the spotlight. Chloroform was seen by many as a more powerful and elegant solution. It was easier to use, it did not require the same bulky and complicated equipment that ether did, and it worked much faster to bring a patient into a state of unconsciousness. As these chemicals began to spread from city to city, the entire system of medicine had to rewrite its rules from scratch. This was no longer just a laboratory curiosity or a trick for the elite. It was a mass market transformation of how every hospital in the world operated. The adoption of anesthesia was not just about the discovery of the chemicals themselves, but about the slow and difficult creation of professional standards. In those early years, there was a great deal of trial and error. Some doctors gave too little of the gas, and patients would suddenly wake up in the middle of a delicate surgery. Other doctors gave too much, and the patients simply never woke up at all. This precarious balance led to the birth of an entirely new profession, one dedicated solely to the administration and monitoring of these gases. It was no longer enough for a surgeon to simply have a steady hand and a fast blade. The medical team now required a specialist whose entire job was to monitor the breath, the skin tone, and the pulse of the person on the table. This specialization represented a massive shift in the economics and the organization of healthcare. It required new forms of training, the invention of new equipment, and a completely new way of thinking about the safety of the patient. The surgeon was no longer the sole master of the room. He was now part of a coordinated team. As the practice began to scale up, it found its way into different corners of society, but it also faced significant pushback. One of the biggest hurdles was not scientific, but moral and religious. There were many people who believed that pain was a natural and necessary part of the human life cycle. Some even argued that it was a divine punishment or a test of character that should not be bypassed by man-made chemicals. This debate was particularly intense when it came to the use of anesthesia during childbirth. The cultural tide finally turned when the most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria, chose to use chloroform during the birth of her children. The royal endorsement changed everything. If the Queen could use it, the general public decided that it must be acceptable and safe for everyone else. This social validation caused the demand for anesthesia to skyrocket, turning what was once a terrifying, once-in-a-lifetime ordeal into a manageable and planned medical event. The mass adoption of these gases meant that surgeries could now be scheduled, organized, and executed with a level of calm and preparation that was previously impossible. The ripple effects of this change were profound and reached far beyond the walls of the operating room. Because surgeons finally had the gift of time, they were no longer forced to work with frantic speed. They could begin to develop more complex and intricate techniques. They could take the time to carefully tie off individual blood vessels, clean out deep wounds more thoroughly, and eventually move their work into the sensitive areas of the abdomen, the chest, and even the brain. The definition of what was possible in medicine expanded almost overnight. This shift also changed the hierarchy of the medical field. The old-school surgeons, who relied on brute physical strength and the ability to work amidst chaos, found themselves being replaced by a new generation of careful, methodical practitioners. The focus of the profession shifted away from the ego and the speed of the surgeon and moved toward the comfort and the long-term survival of the patient. However, this transition also revealed a new and deadly set of problems. Now that people were surviving the initial trauma of the surgery itself, they were beginning to die in huge numbers from infections that set in several days later. Anesthesia had solved the immediate problem of pain, but it had also made surgeons much more ambitious. They were performing more frequent and much more invasive procedures than ever before. Without the knowledge of germs and bacteria, which would not be understood until much later, surgeons were often inadvertently spreading deadly diseases from one patient to the next with their unwashed hands and tools. The very success of anesthesia actually served to highlight the desperate need for better hygiene and sanitation. It was a compounding story of human progress, where one massive breakthrough shone a bright light on the next bottleneck that needed to be cleared. The victory over pain had opened a door, but it had also led the medical world into a new and dangerous territory. Why does this story of gas and sponges still matter to us today? Every time a person goes to a dentist to have a tooth pulled or enters a modern hospital for a life-saving operation, they are the direct beneficiaries of those first frightening experiments with ether and chloroform. We live in a world where we have the luxury of expecting our medical care to be painless, a comfort that our ancestors could not have imagined, even in their wildest dreams. Anesthesia is the quiet, invisible foundation upon which all modern surgical innovation is built. Without that initial discovery, there would be no organ transplants, no heart bypasses, and no advanced robotic surgeries. It changed our very concept of the human experience, taking physical pain from an unavoidable and crushing part of existence and turning it into a technical problem that can be managed and solved. It proved that through the careful study of chemistry and the power of observation, we could master one of the most basic and primal forces of our own biology. The shift from the frantic, bloody theaters of the early 19th century to the sterile, quiet, and controlled operating rooms of today represents one of the greatest leaps in the history of our species. It was a move from a time of limited options and extreme suffering to a time of precision and hope. As we look back at the 1840s and the 1860s, we can see the exact moment when medicine stopped being a grim and desperate necessity and started becoming a true science. The world was learning how to manage the human body in ways that were previously thought to be impossible. But as hospitals became more advanced and more people survived their procedures, the world outside the hospital walls was becoming increasingly dangerous, crowded, and dirty, leading to a new set of challenges for the growing industrial world. And that is how the victory over pain set the stage for a new era of medical possibility. As we move forward in our timeline to the year 1858, we will see how the focus shifted from saving lives on the operating table to saving entire cities from the ground up. In our next episode, we explore the massive engineering feat of sewage systems and urban sanitation that changed the stakes for human survival. If you enjoyed this look at the history of technology,